It's one of the most powerful anecdotes of the Normandy campaign. A captured German general is brought to the coast, where he sees the Allied logistical machine in full force, an endless fleet of ships on the horizon, and on land, mountains of ammunition, fuel, and food. Stunned into silence, he finally turns to his captors and declares, "The war is lost." The general in this story is almost always identified as Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Field Marshal Rommel's own chief of staff. It's a perfect, dramatic scene, but it's also a myth. In July 1944, Hans Speidel was not a prisoner. He was still at his command post, fighting the very invasion he supposedly surrendered to. And yet, the legend of the stunned general persists for a reason. It points to a more profound truth about the Normandy campaign. This is the story of the Allied supply machine, a system of such unprecedented scale and efficiency, it would become one of the decisive factors of the war. We will move past the battlefield myth to find the documented reality, the verified reports and private admissions from the German High Command as they faced a logistics network that defied all their strategic calculations. So, what is the real story of how they discovered they weren't just fighting an army, but an entire industrial world delivered to the shores of France? To understand their shock, we must first understand the problem they believed was unsolvable. By early 1944, the defense of Western Europe rested in the hands of one of Germany's most famous commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and Rommel operated on a single, brutal calculation. He believed the war in the West would be decided in the first 24 hours of an invasion, on the beaches themselves. Because if the Allies couldn't be thrown back into the sea immediately, Germany had a second, seemingly foolproof way to win: starvation. The entire German strategy was built on a logistical truth. A modern, mechanized army is a ravenous beast. To keep just one American armored division fighting for a single day required over 600 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, and above all, nearly 80,000 gallons of fuel. For an entire army of 1 million men, the daily requirement would exceed 20,000 tons. The only way to move that kind of tonnage is through a major, deep water port with cranes, docks, and rail connections. Ports like Cherbourg, Le Havre, or Antwerp. From the German perspective, supplying a massive army directly over open beaches for more than a few days was pure fantasy. Their own experience had taught them this. By 1944, Allied air power had systematically dismantled the French railway system and shattered the bridges over the Seine and Loire rivers. German commanders struggled to move a single panzer division 100 miles. Their own logistics were in a state of constant crisis. They projected this reality onto their enemy. If they couldn't reliably supply their troops on land, how could the Allies possibly sustain an invasion from the sea without a port? Therefore, the German plan was coldly logical. Step 1. Fortify the coast to make the initial landing as costly as possible. Step 2. Concentrate panzer divisions inland, ready to seal off any successful beachhead. Step 3. Defend the major ports to the last man. Deny the Allies a harbor, and the invasion force, no matter how large, would be trapped. Its tanks would run out of fuel. Its guns would fall silent. The entire enterprise would grind to a halt and be annihilated. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just concrete and steel, it was a bet against Allied logistics. On June 6, 1944, the Allies came ashore. They breached the wall and established a foothold, but just as Rommel had calculated, the critical port of Cherbourg did not fall. It was now a fortress, fiercely defended. The Allied armies were on the continent, their numbers growing by the hour, and the clock was ticking. For the German commanders, the days following D-Day were a period of tense, expectant waiting. They watched the beachhead, knowing that every shell the Allies fired, every gallon of fuel they burned, brought them closer to the supply crisis that would strangle their invasion. But the crisis never came. Instead, something impossible began to rise from the sea. It was Operation Mulberry. The Allies hadn't just planned to capture a port, they brought one with them. Towed across the channel in hundreds of pieces were massive concrete caissons, floating breakwaters, and miles of steel piers. Assembled off Omaha and Gold beaches, 2 gigantic prefabricated harbors took shape, creating calm water where there was only open sea. Simultaneously, a second, more direct solution was unfolding right on the sand. A revolutionary fleet of ships, the landing ship, tank, or LST, was doing what was thought to be unworkable. These flat-bottomed vessels drove straight onto the beaches, opened their huge bow doors, and disgorged fully loaded trucks, tanks, and artillery directly onto French soil. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. By the end of the second week, the daily tonnage of supplies landing across the beaches and through these artificial ports was greater than the pre-war capacity of a major harbor like Le Havre. For the German High Command, this wasn't just a setback, it was the complete invalidation of their core strategy. The logistical checkmate they had counted on was gone. The Allied army would not starve. They had built an industrial miracle on the coast of Normandy. But was it invincible? The Mulberry Harbors were the skeleton of a new reality. But it was the system of muscle, nerves, and blood that fed this new reality, 24 hours a day, which truly broke the German war plan. This was not a battle. It was a relentless, round-the-clock industrial process executed on a hostile shore. At the heart of it was a constant moving bridge of steel. Liberty ships and ocean-going freighters, too large to beach, anchored in the newly sheltered waters. From their sides, a swarm of smaller, purpose-built craft went to work. Self-propelled barges, nicknamed rhinos, formed of floating pontoon sections, would ferry tanks, bulldozers, and heavy artillery to the shore. But the real workhorses were the DUKWs. These 2.5-ton amphibious trucks, affectionately called ducks, were the logistical lifeblood of the beachhead. A duck would drive down a ramp into the hold of a ship, load up with ammunition or rations, drive back out into the water, motor to the beach, and then simply drive up the sand, past the chaos of the shoreline, and continue inland to a forward supply dump, miles from the coast. There was no unloading and reloading. It was a seamless point-to-point delivery system, a non-stop conveyor belt from sea to front line. Managing this controlled chaos were the unsung heroes of the invasion, the U.S. Naval Beach Battalions and the Army Engineer Special Brigades. Under sporadic artillery fire and the threat of air attack, these men were the traffic cops, stevedores, and medics of the beaches. They cleared mines, laid down steel matting to create roads over soft sand, directed the endless columns of trucks, and recovered damaged vehicles. By mid-June, they were landing over 150,000 men and 25,000 vehicles every single week. Yet even this wasn't enough to fuel the advance. A modern army's greatest thirst is for gasoline. To quench it, Allied planners conceived of one of the most audacious engineering projects of the war, Operation Pluto, for pipelines under the ocean. The plan was to lay flexible, armored pipelines directly across the floor of the English Channel, pumping fuel from Britain straight to France. Giant floating drums called conundrums, each weighing 1,600 tons when spooled with pipe, were designed to unreel these conduits like massive threads. While the first successful pipeline wouldn't be operational until August, the infrastructure to receive the fuel was built from the very first days. Tankers anchored offshore pumped millions of gallons into a sprawling, camouflaged network of storage tanks and fuel dumps hidden in the fields and woods of Normandy. From these dumps, the fuel made its final journey in the single most important container of the ground war, the 5-gallon steel can. Ironically, the Allies called it the jerry can because they had reverse-engineered the superior German design after discovering their own tins were flimsy and prone to leaks. Thousands of men in logistical companies did nothing but shuttle these cans, forming human chains to load trucks that would race toward the front. The sound of an armored division wasn't just its engines, it was the clang of thousands of jerry cans keeping it alive. And the tide of material just kept rising. By early July, the beaches had swallowed mountains of supplies, over 500,000 tons of ammunition alone. Enough K-rations to feed an army for months, but it was the specialized cargo that revealed the true depth of the Allied logistical advantage. Refrigerated ships, a luxury unimaginable to any other army in the world, delivered fresh meat, butter, and vegetables to warehouses on the beachhead. Most critically, they carried whole blood. Stored in refrigerated units, this blood meant that a severely wounded soldier could receive a life-saving transfusion at a forward aid station, just miles from the fighting. The Allies weren't just supplying a war machine, they were sustaining a society, complete with a state-of-the-art healthcare system on a foreign shore. For the German commanders watching from their bunkers, this was a slow-motion nightmare. At first, reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots were dismissed as panicked exaggeration. They spoke of a bridge of ships that never ended, stretching from the horizon all the way back to England. But soon, the evidence was undeniable, and it was coming from the front. German field commanders began filing reports filled with a sense of disbelief and despair. They noted the enemy's seemingly casual use of artillery, where a German gun crew had to ration every precious shell. the Americans and British would unleash a Feuerwalze, a rolling wall of fire, for hours on end, simply to suppress a single machine gun. One German intelligence summary from the 7th Army concluded with cold dread that for every one of their artillery pieces, the Allies had at least 10, and they used them without any regard for ammunition expenditure. The effect on morale was devastating. A panzer crew could fight heroically, knocking out several Allied tanks, but the next morning they would face a new line of Shermans, freshly offloaded. They were not fighting soldiers, they were fighting a factory. A German report from Panzer Group West in late June stated it plainly. The enemy's material superiority is terrifying. He can replace his losses in men and materiel with staggering speed. They were being crushed, not by superior tactics or fighting spirit, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of an industrial world. The system had overcome German strategy. It had bypassed their fortified ports and nullified their plan to starve the invasion. The Allied logistical machine, born of British ingenuity and American industrial might, seemed unstoppable. But this perfectly engineered creation, operating on the edge of the sea, had one enemy it could not outproduce, outthink, or overwhelm. An enemy that was now gathering its strength far out in the Atlantic. On June 19th, that enemy arrived. A storm, the worst to hit the English Channel in over 40 years, descended on the Normandy coast. For 3 days, hurricane-force winds and violent seas battered the Allied lodgment. It was the natural disaster Rommel had predicted, a force that accomplished what the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht could not. The American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach, a marvel of engineering, was shattered, torn apart, and utterly destroyed. A complete write-off. This should have been the fatal blow. The Germans watched, believing the invasion would finally choke. Instead, the Allied logistical system demonstrated its greatest and most unexpected strength: resilience. In a moment of crisis, Allied planners made a brutal, pragmatic decision. They would not waste time rebuilding the American harbor. They would abandon it. All effort was pivoted to dramatically increasing the efficiency of unloading directly over the open beaches, proving that the true miracle of Normandy was never the colossal harbors, but the relentless, adaptable fleet of LSTs and DUKWs. The disaster paradoxically proved the system's genius. It was not dependent on one perfect solution, but on a culture of relentless adaptation. The supply machine had survived nature's ultimate test, but now it faced its greatest challenge yet, a race across France that would stretch its lifeline to the absolute limit. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra ripped a hole in the German front. Through this gap poured General Patton's Third Army, advancing not 5 miles a day, but 50. The success was so stunning it created a catastrophic new problem. The advance was outrunning its own fuel supply. Tanks at the very tip of the spear were grinding to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from empty gas tanks. The Allied response was a feat of desperate, organized chaos. The Red Ball Express, a massive, non-stop truck convoy running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nearly 6,000 trucks, driven primarily by African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, raced along a continuous loop of one-way roads, closed to all other traffic. They were the artery, pumping fuel and ammunition from the Normandy beaches directly to the front line, hundreds of miles away. This frantic logistical race fueled the final act of the Normandy campaign. In mid-August, as the Red Ball Express hit its peak velocity, the Allied armies slammed shut the jaws of a giant encirclement around the town of Falaise. The German 7th Army was trapped and systematically destroyed. In the aftermath, the Allies captured over 50,000 prisoners. Among them were dozens of generals and senior staff officers, the very architects of the German defense. For 2 months, they had witnessed the impossible from behind their own lines. Now, they were in Allied custody, ready to be interrogated. The moment of truth, hidden behind the legend of the stunned general, had finally arrived. And so we return to the image from the beginning, the captured German general on the coast, stunned into silence by the scale of the Allied machine. We now know this wasn't Hans Speidel in July. The legend, it turns out, is a composite, an amalgamation of the very real documented reactions of dozens of high-ranking officers captured after the collapse at Falaise. The truth is found not in a single cinematic scene, but in the dry, methodical pages of Allied intelligence reports from late August. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the final governor of Paris, told his interrogators he was shocked by the wealth and profusion of Allied equipment. Corps commanders pulled from the pocket described the material superiority as unbelievable and decisive. For them, the revelation wasn't a dramatic view from a clifftop. It was the daily, frontline experience of being relentlessly pounded by an enemy who never ran out of shells, fuel, or replacements. The war in the West wasn't lost in a moment of insight. It was lost in the slow, grinding realization that they were fighting a mathematical certainty. The German generals had prepared for a war of tactics and brave soldiers, but they were defeated by a war of production and logistics. They came to France to fight an army and found themselves crushed by an entire industrial world delivered to their doorstep.